Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So in March I turned 29 years old, so I am officially in my last year of my 20s. 30 is staring at me right in the face. And today I wanted to talk about classics, which is something that I have not talked about for a little while now on my channel. But I had wanted to do a video about classics that I feel like have spoken to some aspect of my 20s life experience, which admittedly has been a fairly quiet experience, you know, major global pandemic notwithstanding. I have not had the wild 20s hedonistic thing, so I'm afraid in this video you're not going to see any Dorian Grays, no Great Gatsbys, no Brideshead Revisited. I'm not that wild, I'm afraid. And I think you often find that certain classics have different life lessons to teach to different audiences, and some classics are more suited to an older audience, some which are definitely coming of age and have more direct lessons to provide to teenagers or university age. Then you also have characters in classics who are my age, but who have had vastly different life experiences to me, who by my age are parents and married, own businesses, which could not be further away from my 29-year-old self. Some classics have very fantastical plots, some have very dramatic plots, and you can enjoy all of these things, but they can be kind of hard to translate into real life. At least this is the case if you are fortunate and privileged enough to have led a fairly sheltered life. A lot of stories are generally about big life-shattering things happening, and I do think that is really important. Obviously there is a lot of value in reading about people whose life experiences are vastly different to your own. But then there are classics where it's a little bit more down to earth, where it's a little bit more slice of life. Things are just a little bit quieter, a little bit tamer. Books don't have to be relatable to be good or worth reading, but sometimes it's just nice and gratifying to see your life experiences reflected in even the tiniest of ways. And I think it can provide a lot of comfort to read about people whose lives are fairly ordinary, where the development occurs internally rather than externally. And so the majority of the books that I'm going to recommend are generally everyday stories. Some of them can get a little bit dramatic, but rarely are they world-altering situations. And if there are any world-altering situations going on, it's usually in the background. And I know that kind of classic isn't for everyone. I often hear especially people criticising Jane Austen because, oh, it's just people having conversations, or it's just people going from one house to another house. But for every one person who finds that kind of story boring, who doesn't know why it was deemed important enough to write in the first place, there are many others who feel very seen by that. And yeah, that's basically the kind of books that I'm talking about today. The first book that I have to recommend to my fellow 20-somethings is The Blue Castle by Ellen Montgomery. This book follows the life of Valancy Sterling, a young woman who seems very meek and unassuming, but who on her 29th birthday receives a terminal diagnosis from her doctor and decides to take life into her own hands, to break away from her oppressive family, to get a job, to live elsewhere, and in the process finds freedom and finds love. And I think the message you can get from this book if you are also in your 20s is a very important one, which is life is short and you don't know how short it might be. That it's important to take control of your life, to seize opportunities, and how important it is to have the courage to be yourself, even in the face of social expectations and objections. The next book that I would recommend to my fellow 20-somethings is Middlemarch by George Eliot. This book follows many different characters interconnected in this one town of Middlemarch. I often hear people saying that Middlemarch is kind of a microcosm for the rest of the world, but this book is looking at marriage, about human relationships, about politics, societal expectations and how individuals come up against them, and how society copes with a world that is ever changing. I would say the major lesson to take from this book is don't marry a man that you just met just because he has a nice library. I know it's tempting, but you gotta get to know him first. Jokes aside, I think the major lesson that I think people in their 20s can take from this book is that it's important to get a bit of self-awareness before you make major life-altering decisions for yourself. That was really the main thing that jumped out at me from the get-go, especially with the character of Dorothea. This was a book about her really having to be more self-aware and the consequences of her not reflecting on herself before making a major decision about marriage. But generally this book has many characters who are dealing with self-discovery, having to deal with decisions that they made when they were young, and navigating relationships going forward. The next book that I would recommend is the sequel to Little Women, Good Wives. I know that this one is not quite as popular as Little Women, but is actually my favourite of the two. So obviously Little Women is following the March sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth and Amy. They start off as children and teenagers in Little Women, but we see them all become adults in Good Wives. We're looking at their relationships as sisters as they're growing up during the Civil War, dealing with their ambitions versus reality, what society expects of them, and what they are actually able to materially accomplish in their lives. And that's actually the reason that I enjoy Good Wives so much. I only read Little Women in 2019 ahead of wanting to watch the movie, and maybe it's because I didn't read this book growing up that actually Good Wives really spoke to me. I know a lot of people were disappointed with Good Wives because the ambitions that these characters had when they were younger didn't quite pan out, and so people were disappointed. They wanted to see these girls succeed. but I actually took a lot of comfort in watching them having to kind of pivot to reevaluate when life wasn't going their way. Good Wives is really a book that is about embracing change, having to adapt to new circumstances, and that it's okay if all of your childhood dreams don't come true, or at least don't come to pass in the way that you hoped. You can still have a good life. I will say that doesn't mean that you should give up on your passions. It does still irk me that Amy decides that she's going to give up painting. I would personally say though, as an adult in 2024, my advice would be your dreams may not pan out, but you can still pursue them, I think. The next book that I would recommend reading in your 20s is Agnes Gray by Bronte. Most of the Bronte catalogue is pretty dramatic. Agnes Gray is very grounded in comparison. We are following Agnes as she works for two different families working as a governess, having to deal with difficult families, particularly difficult children and their indifferent parents, being treated pretty horribly, the limitations on women living in this Victorian society, that struggle of trying to be independent and living a fulfilling life when you are restricted financially. And the main thing that I took from this as a 20-something was that bad jobs happen to us all and it's okay and things will get better, I promise. I think Agnes Gray as a book does teach a lot about resilience, but also about knowing your own personal boundaries and when enough is enough, when you have to take yourself out of a bad work environment, and that it's important to stay true to your principles, but also you're stronger than you think you are. And often when you look back on a bad experience, you end up realising how much you had to put up with. Obviously we couldn't do this video without talking about Jane Austen, and I just generally feel like you should read all of Jane Austen in your 20s, but not just once. Read them multiple times. Read them in your early 20s, read them in your mid-20s, read them in your late 20s and beyond, just to see how your views change over time for each of the books. Reading Pride and Prejudice in my early 20s at university, I was very swept up in the love story, but in my mid and late 20s, I was really focusing on how both of these characters change, how they have to reevaluate their perceptions. I was thinking a lot about the financial implications. Probably 21-year-old Charlotte looked at Charlotte Lucas and thought she was absolutely mad for marrying Mr. Collins, but 29-year-old Charlotte is thinking, maybe she had a point. I mean, I would not want to marry that man, but financially I understand why it was a very good thing. Honestly, the more that I think about home ownership and how impossible that is, the more I can understand the mercenary marriage strategy of Mrs. Bennet. I'm not saying that I would do that. Like, generally, when it comes to the emotional side, I personally do not feel at all like I am without anything for not having a partner. Like, I feel just fine, I don't feel lonely, but sometimes when you're thinking about renting a one-bedroom, just a one-bedroom flat, that is a complete impossibility for me, and sometimes I just think to myself, it would be nice to have someone to split the bills with. And that feels very much like a Jane Austen novel. It feels like a very mercenary reason to want to have a partner, and I feel like I shouldn't be relating to that quite as much as I do. Thankfully, I'm just fine at the moment and I can definitely deal with shared accommodation for now. But I do feel like I understand if that would be somebody's reason for getting married or just generally having a partner. It's definitely not a concern. But once again, the Jane Austen novels have a lot of lessons to teach in becoming more self-aware, recognising your limitations, recognising your prejudices, cultivating independence in yourself, particularly in a world that doesn't value that, especially in women, navigating different social pressures and finding your own path through those expectations. And when it comes to relationships, I guess the importance of communication, and that the best relationships, whether familial, platonic or romantic, are based on communication and trust and mutual respect. A book that I think is actually a little bit of a successor to Jane Austen is Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. To me, this is actually a more successful version of Mansfield Park. And I do like Mansfield Park, so that's no mean feat to me. This is another long Victorian novel where there are lots of different characters, but we are primarily focusing on the Gibson family, and particularly Molly Gibson, who is once again another shy, retiring young girl who kind of comes of age in this story. And though she's often put upon, though people often don't notice her at first, through the course of the book people start to recognise how brilliant she is, how loyal, how trustworthy she is, how she is reliable and always there. And I think the main takeaway that I got from this, a major life lesson for your 20s that you can take from this book, is family dynamics are complicated. Your family members are just as three-dimensional and complex as you are. And once again, I think if you are lucky enough to have had a fairly sheltered childhood, sometimes it can be a bit of a shock to the system to find out that your parents are flawed beyond the superficial, oh, they wouldn't let me do this. Some children unfortunately always grow up knowing this, but then other children find out when they become adults, oh, all adults are just making things up as they go along, and that includes my parents. And I think Wives and Daughters really gets that across well. There are no moustache twirling villains in this book. I think Elizabeth Gaskell is really great at being able to portray, you know, a stepmother figure, particularly in this book, who is not perfect, but is not two-dimensional. She does bad things, but you can almost understand why she does them. You can understand understand like the insecurities that go into her decisions. You don't have to like her at the end of it, but you do understand her, even though by the end of it I am still rooting for Molly. This next recommendation might be an odd one, but I remember reading The House of Merth a few years ago and thinking, God, this is a very relevant book if you're 29. This probably has the most dramatic plot out of all of the books I'm going to recommend, but I remember particularly reading the beginning of this and just resonating with this feeling that Lily Bart has of being 29 and feeling like you're coming to the end of your time to shine, which seems ridiculous to say out loud, but I think if you have grown up with this like young achievers, 30 before 30, the 20s are your best time of your life mentality, you can get to this age and kind of feel like, oh God, what now? I'm not an adult, I've not sorted my life out, I failed. And what happens to Lily in House of Merth is not a happy ending. I don't know what life lessons you're meant to take from it, but just that feeling of being seen is what I resonated with. And I think it's a great one to read because as a modern reader, I want to shout at Lily, it's not too late for her. You're okay. There are ways around this and she's just not seeing them. But it's easy to see that if you are a reader or if you have any sort of hindsight. And I guess the lesson for somebody reading this in the modern day is to kind of get yourself out of your head and try and be a little bit more objective on your situation. It's hard to navigate through life when your head is very stuck in it. It's easy to feel like there's no way out, but sometimes you just need to be able to get your head out of that situation, try and look at it objectively, and then maybe it's easier to find options out. I don't know if I made any sense saying that, but that's what I took from this book anyway. And then my final recommendation is the later books in the Anne of Green Gables series. The very first Anne of Green Gables book focuses on Anne Shirley when she is a teenager, but the subsequent books in the series, Anne of Avonlea, Anne of the Island, Anne of Windy Willows, Anne's House of Dreams, Anne of Ingleside, but I think that's the one that starts to veer more into the children's perspective than Anne herself. But each of those books are focusing on different aspects of Anne as an adult. That includes continuing her studies, beginning a career, trying to maintain her relationships, both her friendships and romantic. Along the way, she ends up losing important things to her. And there are some moments, particularly in this series, where it gets incredibly sad. And moments where Anne, who has always been this sunny, cheerful person, is feeling incredibly low and dark. But through the course of the book is incredibly resilient and is able to eventually get to a point where she has this positive attitude despite things not always going to plan. And I think that is another important life lesson of the ability to adapt and make course corrections in your life. Plans sometimes have to change. And also, just because you don't do certain things, accomplish certain life goals at the set timeline, doesn't mean that you can't come back and do them later in life. There is a lot of delayed gratification in the Anne of Green Gables storyline. And I think a lot of people can get trapped in this feeling of waiting for life to happen to them, waiting for that next big exciting thing to happen. And I think what Anne of Green Gables shows is that while you're waiting for that big exciting thing to happen, that doesn't mean that your life as it is right now has no exciting things in it by itself. This book series is really about recognizing those small magical things in life rather than waiting for the big moments, the big holidays, the big achievements. And there's beauty everywhere if you just look for it. So there we go, a little bit of a weird video, but hopefully some recommendations here that can provide a little bit of comfort or just generally you feel a bit seen in. If you are a fellow quiet 20-something, I would love to know any other recommendations that you have, classics that you would recommend really for any age. It doesn't just have to be your 20s. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.